is everybody today?
So good.
We should all be rested, relaxed after a nice long weekend. Did anybody actually take a long weekend? I did. Woo! Anybody else? Awesome. Some of us did work.
Yep.
Some of us did not. I want to really quick, I want to save as much time as possible for our guests today, but I did want to take some time to share. I want to hear some good things happening in your world. Let's bring some good energy into the room for today. What was something great that happened this weekend?
I'm sunburned and it feels so good. I'm so grateful for the sunshine.
We're in the sun.
Sunburn and it feels
Today.
so
It feels
good.
so good.
Love
It
it.
hurts so good.
Anyone else? Anything good happening in your world you want to share?
I made it through 18 holes on the golf course with a smile on my face.
Oh, that's a good one. That's a good win. I love it. Christine?
I have some buyer clients and they were looking at a lower price point that's very hard to find anything. And they decided that they're going to buy something bigger that's going to be easier for me to find and just rent the in the house. So,
Oh, nice. Great win-win, huh?
yeah.
Awesome.
My phone died on Friday and I didn't plug it back in until yesterday.
I love it. Talk about a life by design, right? You're like, oh, shucks, it died. I don't have my chargers. I saw Garth Brooks in Vegas this weekend, and I've seen him many, many times, but it was well worth the time and energy. So if you guys get a chance to go, I know he opened more dates. Phenomenal show. It was very, very good. So I highly recommend. Anybody else? Okay, awesome. Our MVVP, this is who we are at Keller Williams. This is what we stand for. I really do love the win-win or no deal. I come back to that all the time. I know I'm always telling you guys about that. But it really is, to me, the mission of building careers worth having, businesses worth owning, lives worth living, and legacies worth leaving. And I think that as I age, I'm getting older and older by the minute, as we all are, but the legacies worth leaving is really important, and the lives worth living. And this weekend was like just a reassurance of God, family, then business is so important, because I got to spend some time with one of my favorite people in the whole wide world, in addition to my immediate family, like my husband, but my sister, who is like fills my soul so much every time I get to see her. So that was just a great reminder of living a life that's lives worth living, and then God, family, then business. Please make sure you're making all of your calls, as I know you all are, in a TCPA friendly, compliant way, because it is actually your responsibility to check and make sure the people you're calling have agreed that you can call. So this is our reminder to you. If you have any questions about it, you should be seeing some pretty regular emails going out about this and how to check and where to check and why you would want to check. So make sure you're doing your calls in the right way. We do have, Eden, do you want to talk about this?
Yes, I do. Okay, I'll keep it short, but do you guys know what Keller Williams Young Professionals is? Have you heard of that yet? Okay, because if you haven't, it's a community within the company that is specifically for young professionals, so 40 and under. And it's been an established community for quite a few years, but we're finally bringing the chapter to Utah now. And so I'm super excited. I got the opportunity to be the director of operations on the board of directors to help really kind of build this thing out and create this launch. So I'm super excited for lots of value to building out the new generation of real estate leaders. So if this is something you're interested in, or if you know somebody that would be interested in, I'd love to talk to them about it. But there's two things that I wanted to share with you guys. This is kind of like our first pre-launch event that we're going to be hosting. And we have Gary Keller teaching his Quantum Leap course. You guys know what Quantum Leap is? It is incredible. He basically has taken the 4 core principles of what it takes to building a big life. If it's financial, understanding, if it's setting big goals, and he teaches this to young professionals. So if you have somebody in your life, if you have your own children, or like somebody in your SOI that has kids, probably within the range of 18 to 26 or so, give or take, you could do 16 to 30.
Yeah,
I mean,
my daughter go at 16.
Yeah, anybody can go. So this is one opportunity that we wanted to give to you guys, to reach out to your SOI, to provide value to them, to say, hey, come and learn from a billionaire about how he's built his life. So we're going to be holding it at the Keller Williams office in Cottonwood Heights. It's going to be a virtual event, but they can still come if they want to. If you're a KWYP member, It's totally free to you and your clients. If you're a non-net member, then it's $10 per person. If you have any questions on that, I'd love to have you guys come if you can. If you haven't been to Quantum Leap, you still should. Yes.
So is it just for people who are real estate professionals or?
No, it's anybody. Yeah, it doesn't have to be real estate related at all. So yeah, he talks about building a big life, how to invest your money and have good financial understanding, what like your money rules are. I mean, it's teaching you the basics of what I think children should be taught in high school, but they're not. So this is the opportunity to do that.
And you can go in person.
No, he's facilitating it in Austin in person, but we're gonna be live streaming it at the Conway Heights office.
But you go there.
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so this is a great SOI touch if you guys want to use this. So I wanted to share that with you. And then the next one is we're actually going to be doing our actual launch party, our chapter launch party at Edison House in Salt Lake. If you guys don't know what Edison House is, it's freaking rad. It's super cool. You guys gotta check it out. But it's Salt Lake's newest, like hottest, like social club. So you have to be a member to go, but we were able to get you guys in. So if you want to come in and network, we actually got Brady Sandall to be our keynote speaker. He is the head for Keller Williams Luxury. So he's going to be kind of setting the bar high with how we provide our clients with a luxurious client experience. And then Tyson, he's actually, he just got Rookie of the Year for building his business 100% from social media. He's a huge agent in California, and he's one of our Keller Williams Young Professional Directors as well. So he's going to share how he's built his business. But we have a rooftop, we're gonna have a rooftop networking bar. It's a super cool vibe. So if you want to come and check it out, we want to invite anybody to come to this. It's free if you're a KWYP member, and I'll send this out, but the pricing will go up if you're a non-KWYP member. And we do invite you to bring a +1 after we do the keynote speaker for networking and socialing for $39. So if you have questions, I've got more information here. If you want to be involved in leadership, we are trying to build our board of directors still. So we have leadership opportunities for young professionals as well. Yeah.
If I wanted to bring a young professional, but I'm not young, can I still come?
Yes, you still can come. You just can't be a member,
Okay.
but you can still come and you can still attend anything. It's an open invite to all. So
And can you actually not be a member? Because Kimber told me once that maybe you guys changed that. That is, it was young or young at heart.
yeah, okay, yes.
So you
Yes.
could be a member if you wanted. Okay,
Okay.
awesome. Ken.
Wow. All right. How many of you are always looking for a way to add value to your clients? If you raise your hand, you can leave now. Okay. So today I want to help you with that mission. So I recently bought a nightly rental in St. George, and I want to bang it out and get some good exposure for it. So I'm offering to you to post. So we just put a Facebook post on our company's Facebook. And so if you will like and share that out, we're going to randomly pick one of your clients for a 3-night stay in the villa, $1,000 value. And so just go to the website, share it, like it, tag me. And then Friday, we're going to pick the winner. And it's going to be one of your clients for a 3-night stay. I'm taking care of everything. It's on the 18th hole at the Ledges, and it has a private hot tub. There's racquetball courts, all kinds of amenities in the complex. And then here's the other part. If your client is selected, you're getting a 2-night stay for free. That's a $600 value. So it's a total of $1,500 value, 2-night stay for you if we select your client, and a 3-night stay for your client. All expense paid. They have to pay nothing. Taking care of everything. So like, share, and tag, and good luck.
Awesome.
We've also got one other last minute
here I am.
announcement.
That's me.
And we wanted to just show some love to our fearless leader who had her
Really?
birthday last
By the
week. Birthday, let's show her some love, yeah? Happy birthday.
Happy birthday.
Happy birthday to you.
We'll cut this up if you want some ice cream cake after.
Yeah, if anybody wants to take
Happy
some ice
free.
cream, awesome. Oh, thanks, guys. As you know, if you've been around me any length of time, I actually really do enjoy my birthday because guess what? It's a day to celebrate. You're still alive. It's all about you. When people are like, "Oh, I hate birthdays. It's a sign of getting older." I'm like, you know what is worse? Not getting older. So I'm going to celebrate it all the time. I think I'm not clicking again. Oh, sorry. I'm trying to be. Okay, so Kreg Wagner, if you guys have not heard him before, he's amazing. He helps keep a lot of us out of hot water at the UAR legal hotline, and he always does a great job. Sean and I were in a class with him just this last week, and I was just saying how much I love that you handle a healthy debate in a very interesting and great way, and you always bring such value and content. So we're excited to have him come and speak. He's going to share some things that he's seen and that we see commonly through the UAR legal hotline. And then also, if there's any questions that you have specific for Kreg, he told me personally, no topics off limits. He'll answer anything we want him to answer that's a legitimate real estate question within realm, right within that world. So if you guys have any questions, feel free to keep them for him. And then with that, I'm going to give the rest of the time to Kreg. Thank you.
Wow, that was quite the intro. I appreciate that. It's always interesting. When I posted on Facebook, I think 4 or 5 months ago about doing these brokerage Q&As, I didn't realize that I'd be able to see how brokerages do their training meetings and kind of, conduct their meetings. And so I really loved kind of the missions that you had. I spent this last weekend with family in St. George. My sister and her family are going to be deployed to South Korea for 3 years. And so it was great being able to spend time with family and kind of, I love the order of what you have there. So I love the mission here. So my name is Kreg Wagner. I'm legal counsel for the Utah Association of Realtors. I've been with the UAR for 11 years now. And it's gone by incredibly quick. I love what I do. I love answering questions. I've answered hundreds of thousands of questions, and that's not hyperbole. I've answered that many. When I first started, it was short sales and third-party approvals and learning about that process. And then we got into multiple offers and non-refundable earnest money. What's amazing is this past month, I've had questions about short sales and I've had questions about non-refundable earnest money. So now we're in some sort of crazy market that I have experience answering these questions. I do want to go over a couple of things, but this is a legal hotline kind of Q&A. I mean, that's the way that I posed it on Facebook. So really, if there's any sort of question that you have, feel free to pose it. I want to cover the things that are most meaningful to you. And this is a safe place. There are no stupid questions. I mean, when I first started at the UAR, people kept talking about the REPC. Like, what are they talking about? What is this acronym? MLS, BAC. I had no idea what they were talking about. It is like drinking from a fire hydrant. I get it. I do know what the REPC is now. So it's probably questioning my credentials a little bit. But yeah, I mean, feel free to ask any sort of question. There's probably someone that has a similar question that you do. So feel free to ask any question. Are there anything that you want to cover right now? Any question that you have posing? Yeah.
What's coming up with the transaction coordination dilemma?
Okay, so transaction coordinators, do you guys know what those are? Maybe I'll give you a brief overview. So there is nothing in state law, the statutes or admin rules that talks about transaction coordinators. It's silent. This sounds flippant. I don't mean it to be. It's kind of a made up term in our industry, right? At least in Utah. There are other designations in other states, but in Utah, there is no such thing as a transaction coordinator, at least defined by the Utah Administrative Code or under statute. Okay, so it's either licensee activities or unlicensed activities, right? So you're either doing things that are licensed or unlicensed. Those are the two things, right? And so when it comes to transaction coordination, this is something the Division of Real Estate has assigned a task force. 2 real estate commissioners are on this. They're going to be looking at the rules. to see, okay, what are some ways that we can allow transaction coordination to take place in Utah? I think for sure, an agent from another brokerage could do transaction coordinating for another brokerage if they're doing unlicensed activities. Now, when you blur that line between unlicensed to licensed, I don't know where that line is. I think that's pretty risky. But if you did, only unlicensed things like clerical duties, then I suppose you could do that for another brokerage. Once you start crossing that line, drafting addenda, doing things that require a real estate license, then you would need to have agency. And so if you're doing that for another brokerage, then I would say you need to have some sort of co-agency relationship with that other brokerage. Now, we may be looking at the rules at the Division of Real Estate of ways that could be facilitated. But the simplest way that I can answer this is if you're affiliated with one brokerage, which all of you are affiliated with KW, then doing licensee activities for another brokerage, that's going to be pretty tricky to do. And frankly, if you have legal counsel, maybe you could draft language that allows for that agency agreement, but most brokerages aren't going to be drafting that. I mean, records retention. Think about that. If I have agency, there is a requirement to have records retained at your brokerage. If I'm doing licensee activities for another brokerage, does my brokerage now need to retain those records when they're kind of the subsidiary agent or the co-agent involved in that situation? I can make an argument that, yeah, they do. The client should know that you're not affiliated with that brokerage that they signed up with. So I know it's happening. And to be frank, I don't think that consumers have been harmed in any sort of way, but there is that potential. And so that's where I do think that the rules would have to be adjusted for licensee activities to take place with another brokerage. You get me excited about transaction core. I get going. I appreciate that. Any other related or unrelated questions? Again, safe spot. Yeah.
How much longer are we gonna have to do transaction document receipts?
Transaction document receipts. So help me understand exactly, because that could vary from brokerage to brokerage.
Oh, is that a brokerage thing?
That's a brokerage thing for us.
Yeah, so I'll defer.
So the question is how long are we gonna do it? So the division, the administrative code requires us to give proof that we've given them copies of all of their stuff. So in our MLS, we have the transaction document receipt, which is almost a duplicate of if you were to go through any of the electronic signature things, there's the history of that, if there's another name for it,
Sure.
right? So that's the transaction document receipt is a version of that.
Okay.
So
Yeah, that's gonna vary from brokerage to brokerage. The only requirement in Utah, at least when it comes to records retention, is anything that's signed by the client. You just need to keep a record of that for 3 years after the year in which it was signed. But outside of that, it's going to be dictated by your brokerage policies.
Got it.
Good. Good.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's perfect. Any other questions? Yeah.
So, go back to a few years ago, when we had all these questions, you have an offer, seller waits to respond, you're negotiating back and forth, we pass the deadline,
Sure.
whatever that deadline date is.
Yeah.
So then the seller responds and says, seller response time extended to, what's the proper protocol for that?
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I actually have that as one of my things to address. So that's fantastic.
Thank you.
This is a question that I think seasoned brokers ask and then newer agents ask. So when you write an offer, you have the 6-page rep sheet, right? And you write an offer and you put in that on page 6, an acceptance deadline, right? So a window of time in which the other side can accept, right? And oftentimes we as an industry collectively, not individually, but collectively, we call it the response deadline. That's incorrect. I mean, it's an acceptance deadline. And the reason why it matters, and frankly, it matters to me, is simply because there's some confusion about that language. When we call it a response deadline, we think, oh, I have to respond by that deadline. And if I don't, then somehow I've done something inappropriate. I mean, the deadline can oftentimes be really quick. So let's say it's 5 p.m. today. Yeah, that's a short turnaround if I submit an offer. So an acceptance deadline of 5 p.m. Let's say the seller, they're out, right? They're celebrating a birthday, or they're out doing something, and they're not going to see it until after 5 p.m. today. And they want to, look at it, and let's say they do want to counter that offer. Simplest way is they then write addendum number 1 as a counter offer. They mark counter on page 6 of the REPSI, and they counter with addendum number 1. And addendum number 1 will change whatever terms that they want to counter: purchase price, earnest money, deadlines. And addendum number 1 will have a brand new acceptance deadline. So you're free to respond after an offer has lapsed. You're just not free to accept. Okay, and that's why there's that difference. You can respond to an offer a year from now if you want to. It may not, be all that fruitful, but yeah, you can respond whenever you want. It's just that window of time to accept is finite. And so when you counter, you're creating a brand new acceptance window. So in a way, you are countering that original acceptance deadline. And so what I would caution, because I've seen people get into trouble, is if they counter and they only counter, they say, hey, buyer's original acceptance, usually they say response, buyer's original response deadline is extended until 5 p.m. tomorrow. And the buyer say, great, accepted. Are you under contract at that point? I think there's a decent argument that you might be under contract at that point, which wasn't the intent, right? The intent was just to extend the acceptance window. But once you have acceptance of the last addendum, you're now under contract. And so that's where I would refrain from doing something like extending the response deadline. There was a hand right here and then right over here.
I would say, so if in that same scenario, seller can't get to it, they look at it, they're like, hey, this looks great, then you would extend their acceptance, and as soon as it's signed, so talk about that.
Yeah, if that's the case, if let's say the seller says, man, this is a really good offer, I don't want to change anything, but I can't accept it because it's lapsed, there's nothing to accept. Then at that point, all they would have to do, send over a counter offer, just changing the acceptance deadline. And then if the other side accepts, then you're under contract. Right here.
That's the same. So it's just if your seller doesn't get to it in time, and you decide you do like it, it's just write the addendum up, they accept all the terms, and they, push the date out. And then those guys sign it.
And you guys all know that chances are, if someone's not in this class or another one of my classes, they just go ahead and they accept it, right? They just go ahead and accept it at 6 p.m. or 7 p.m. after the offer is lapsed. Are you under contract at that point? Well, I'll answer it like an attorney. It depends, right? That's the easiest way for me to answer anything. It depends because it then depends on the subsequent actions of the two parties. If they move forward and seller's disclosures are given, due diligence is conducted, and appraisal, then it's pretty clear from the actions of the party there's a contract. It's not the safest course of action. At that point, I would want a subsequent addendum that just clarifies. So if that ever happens to any of you, let's say you write an offer and the seller accepts it after the acceptance window, I personally would have a subsequent addendum just clarifying that the two parties agree that they're under contract.
It makes it void, but not voidable.
Yeah, it brings into question because that was a term of the contract and it wasn't adhered to as per the language of the contract itself. Yeah.
Can you just explain what Sean just said a little bit from your perspective, void versus voidable?
Yeah, so a voidable contract doesn't automatically cancel. It could become canceled. So for example, an example of a voidable contract would be, let's say buyer fails to deliver earnest money in time. It doesn't automatically cancel, but it could be canceled by the seller in that instance. Or another example would be, let's say sellers fail to give seller's disclosures by the seller disclosure deadline. Contract doesn't automatically cancel, but it could become voidable or canceled by the buyer in that instance because it's now a breach of contract. Another example that I think is a common misconception, let's say neither party settles. Does the contract automatically cancel in that situation? If neither party settles by the settlement deadline,
Oh, great question.
I would get another addendum to clean it up, maybe extend that settlement deadline. But it doesn't automatically cancel. So if both parties still move forward and try to settle even after that settlement deadline, and let's say they do, great, successful transaction. Not ideal, right? Because you would want to have it clarified, but it doesn't automatically cancel. It becomes voidable in that instance, probably by either party could cancel in that situation. Yeah.
Okay, so back to the seller's disclosure issue. So let's say seller's disclosures didn't get over, seller thought they did, but they didn't.
Sure.
Buyers moving forward, wasn't an issue, inspection was done, got straight to closing day before she canceled, but then then they're trying to argue that, well, the seller, because he thought he had the disclosures in, but he didn't, he canceled the contract, the buyer should then get earnest money, even though she canceled the contract right before settlement, and she's the one that defaulted.
Because they never
Scenario.
did seller's disclosures, is that?
No, that's a good scenario. I like that. So let me just reiterate. So you have buyer and seller under contract. Seller fails to deliver a completed disclosure. So let's say they just failed to give the HOA minutes. That happens all the time. Or they failed to give the commitment for title insurance. That happens all the time. Okay, but the buyer in your scenario continues forward anyways, does due diligence, has an appraisal, but then the day before the settlement deadline, they say, hey, I actually want to cancel. And they do. And they say, not only do we want our earnest money back, seller, we want you to pony up a sum equal to it because you technically breached the contract. And that's one of my remedies in section 16.2 of the reps. Is that fair to say? Is that kind of the scenario? And now you're saying, Craig, will you tell me what happens in that situation? You didn't say it like that. You weren't that. You weren't that harsh, but I can see it in your tone. No, I can see it. I don't know. It depends. Because I think there's a legitimate argument that the buyer may have waived their right to call the seller out on default because they continue forward anyways. But it depends. Did the buyer continue to ask for those HOA minutes? Did they continue to ask for that commitment for title insurance? If they did, they may have preserved their right to cancel even after all of their deadlines. And so for me, I mean, I've got seller's disclosures on here as well. I get on my soapbox whenever I talk about seller's disclosures. I think that is one of the greatest areas of liability from a contract standpoint that a seller has to a buyer. And I think collectively, not individually, but collectively, we treat it pretty casually. Where we say, oh, I'll get you the HOA minutes when I get to it. Or, oh, I'll get you the commitment for title insurance when I get to it. Or yeah, copy the leases, we'll get you those. But then the deadline comes and goes. Well, the deadline is a set deadline. And when you read the deadline in conjunction with section 21 of the REPC, which is the time is of the essence clause, it says performance will be rendered strictly according to that deadline. So that makes it a material term of the contract, which means if a party fails to meet their contractual obligation by that deadline, then that's a breach of contract. And I have heard, not rampant, but I have heard instances of where buyers cancel the REPC, not because of due diligence, not because of financing or appraisal, but they canceled because the seller failed to deliver full disclosures as per section 7. HOA minutes, copies of leases.
But in the situation where a buyer just changes their mind and then tries to use the other as an excuse to get their earnest money back, but they clearly canceled the contract because they just didn't want to move forward.
Sure.
That doesn't seem like there's teeth in their argument.
It then becomes a legal battle.
Yeah.
And it does raise the stakes for the sellers significantly. Because think about it, if a buyer cancels the day before the settlement deadline and the seller is expecting to get the buyer's earnest money, and now the buyer is saying, hey, seller, you pay a sum equal to it, that's scary for a seller, right? Especially if it's $5,000, $10,000. I mean, that's hard for a seller to say, oh, I think I'm in the right. I think I can prove that the buyer waived their right to strict adherence to the contract. But now I have to make that legal argument. So I would, as a seller, I would much rather have completed my contractual obligation than have to rely after the fact that, hey, buyer, you waived your right, and have to prove it from a fact situation.
So if the seller decides to, it sounds like it would be smarter for the seller just to release the earnest money and just say, hey, I'm either gonna take you to court and prove that you stayed here, or just take the earnest money and walk away.
It's a potential option. I think ultimately the seller would need to make that decision. Ideally, there would be something like a resolution of the earnest money dispute form signed, where it absolves either party from any liability or ongoing
Okay, so make sure you get that.
something like that to absolve any sort of liability.
Yeah, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So would there have to be in that circumstance, because just like you said, this is not uncommon for people to say, oh, I couldn't get the HOA minutes, and you're like, keep trying.
Yeah.
But, because there's not like a deadline attached to for the buyer to review, that kind of rolls into their due diligence deadline, right? So I guess what would the advice be in the event that your due diligence deadline is coming up and you still don't have, say, a budget from your HOA or most recent minutes? Because there are times that those minutes or budgets or whatever have extremely important information that would be a reason that a buyer would want to no longer continue forward with the contract. So would the advice be just make sure that by the due diligence deadline that you're still pushing for that? If they don't get it, then at that point, they're kind of like either have to accept to move on or cancel the contract.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question. And I understand that it's really easy for me as a non-practitioner to say, hey, this is what you should do, right? Because you guys understand the emotions that are attached to a buyer and a seller, and how easy or difficult it may be to amend the real estate purchase contract. From my standpoint, and again, easy for me to say, if a seller has passed their seller disclosure deadline, but still needs to fulfill certain aspects of it, I would amend the deadline. And that may be amending all of the deadlines to make it work so that the buyer has sufficient time to take that information and to conduct a thorough due diligence. That's easy for me to say. I recognize that's easy for me to say. At a bare minimum, if I represent the buyer, I would continue to ask the seller for that information to demonstrate that I'm not waiving my right to receive that contractual, obligation or right from the seller. So I would continue to press the seller, hey, I still need those HOA minutes. I still need those financials. And then document so that your buyer has at least something preserved to show that they didn't think it wasn't a big deal, because it is. I mean, I've seen the CEO of the Salt Lake Board, Curtis Bullock, he had my position before I started the UAR. He's been an expert witness in some of those situations where leases were provided after due diligence, after the financing and appraisal deadline, and the buyers canceled, and the court agreed with the buyers, saying, hey, those were material terms that should have been disclosed by a set deadline. And in those cases, the buyers continued to ask for those copies. And so that showed that they still consider them material. Good questions. Excellent. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah, I've got a couple of things that I can cover. One is fairly interesting. At least it's interesting to me because it's somewhat litigious, and I like reading kind of pleadings and motions. So this is an issue that was raised to the UAR over a year ago. So this was a text message or a purported text message real estate purchase contract. Okay, so here was the scenario. You had a landlord who obviously owned the property with their tenants, and they were negotiating over a period of months the potential purchase of the property by the tenants. So the tenants wanted to become the buyers. And we're talking about a $2.2 million property in Summit County. Okay, so it's a higher end property, $2.2 million. They had negotiated kind of the purchase price, going back and forth a little bit, and they seem to have somewhat of an agreement. And so the buyers / tenant sent a text message, and I have a copy of it. So here's what they said. The buyer sent this to one of the sellers who own this property in joint tenancy. Okay, I'm kind of leading you a little bit, but just think about that. Okay, so one of the sellers. Sounds like you have a deal, ! Do you want to draw up the paperwork, or do you want me to? ? Okay, so that was the buyer's acceptance of the contract via the text message. Sounds like you have a deal. Do you want to drop the paperwork or do you want me to? Okay, so, the sellers, when they get that, they see that as, okay, we have an agreement in principle, but we still need something to consummate the agreement, i.e. a real estate purchase contract, i.e. signatures from both the sellers. And the sellers ultimately said, no, we actually want to list this property. We think we can get closer to 2.6. And so they say, sorry, we actually changed our mind. We're not going to move forward with this. You're welcome to make an offer. Buyers file a lis pendens on the property in May of 2022. Okay, so again, a year ago, they filed this lis pendens saying these text messages.
Remind me of what that means.
So that's indicating that there is a legal action on the property. It's clouding title so that it gives notice to other potential buyers that, hey, this property is in legal question. There's question about its availability for sale. Good question. And so they do this, they encumber the property, they file this lien on the property, and they say, look, we want to enforce our purchase agreement, our text message purchase agreement. That was what the buyers were arguing. Now, sellers file a motion to dismiss saying, hey, we don't even have signatures on this. And it's pretty clear in Utah that you need to have signatures in order to sell real property. Even if one party signed, you still need the other one to sign. And one of the reasons why the UAR got involved is because the allegation was that the seller, one of the sellers, who is a real estate agent, was acting in her real estate agent capacity and had the ability to sign on behalf of her husband or / client. Now, we cared about that because how often do any of you negotiate terms of a deal via text message or email? I imagine that happens all the time, right? And so we cared about this, so we actually filed a motion to appear as amicus curiae. That's a fancy way of saying friend of the court, that we cared about the outcome. And so we filed an amicus curiae, we filed a motion, our amicus brief, to share why our 20,000 members would care whether or not this is deemed a purchase contract or not. So we sided with the sellers, saying, no, this isn't a purchase contract because it doesn't have signatures. It doesn't have enough materiality when it comes to actually forming a purchase contract. Our motion was dismissed. The court said, hey, it's too early for the UAR to get involved in this. And to be frank, I think that was the correct motion. But we wanted the court to know we cared about this, that we were monitoring this issue. In April of this year, so this lien has been on the property for almost a year now, the court heard oral arguments about whether or not the seller's motion to dismiss should be granted. And the seller's motion to dismiss was granted. They dismissed the first two counts. One, that there was a contract. Two, specific performance. They dismissed those with prejudice, which means they dismissed it forever. Now, it doesn't mean it can't be appealed. Everything can be appealed, but they dismissed it saying there's not a contract here. So we're dismissing it with prejudice because there's no contract. So your causes of actions are dismissed.
And to remove the lis pendens.
And they took off the lis pendens. Now, the sellers have counter sued saying, hey, you encumbered our property for almost a year now. We had an opportunity to sell it for about 2.6. We lost that opportunity. Market kind of tanked a little bit, especially higher end right there. And so they said, look, under the Wrongful Lien Act, you didn't have a right to lien our property. Why? Because there wasn't a purchase contract. The court said so. And so they're filing for wrongful lien damages, which is triple damages. So they're trying to get millions of dollars. So it's still ongoing. We're still monitoring. The reason I bring this up is because you have to be so careful in your email and text message communications. I think this is the right decision. For sure, I think this is the right decision. But it doesn't mean that it can't be litigated again. And even though the sellers won, so to speak, on this issue, they really lost when it came to the time, when it came to trying to sell their property, at least during that time period. And so I would hate for any of that to happen with any of your buyers or sellers. So when I'm if I were texting, and you know, if I were a real estate agent, if I were texting, I would just want to make it as clear as possible, you know, rather than say, hey, my seller accepts, and I haven't talked to my seller, I probably wouldn't send that, right? I would say, look, let me talk to my seller and I'll get back to you. I'm being very broad in my responses back, not to be, you know, not to be, you know, lack transparency, but I wouldn't want to try to bind my buyer or seller inadvertently. That happens all the time. I mean, I get calls where an agent says, yeah, my seller will accept that. And then they check with their seller and their seller says no. Then the agent has to go back and say, hey, actually, my seller won't accept that. Yeah.
I just have a question. What would be your guess that those sellers, their price on what they paid an attorney to win?
Well, I have a pretty good idea because the attorney was the one that let us know about the issue. So for one, the E&O insurance for the real estate brokerage did kick in on this issue because she was a real estate agent. So they said, yeah, we'll kick in on that. So they are being covered from the E&O standpoint. But I would imagine they still have spent at least $10,000 to $15,000, depending on. I think the buyers have probably spent close to $50,000 would be my guess. Would be my guess.
Yeah. So it's almost worth maybe trying to settle it, just, I don't know, that just sounds horrible.
I did see some of the negotiations for settlement and they were not palatable to the seller. They were less than the original offer. I think that as we get along, my guess is the sellers and buyers will reach some sort of financial settlement, would be my guess. Because it reaches a point where the buyers who are arguing a really tough position have lost their two main arguments that this is a contract and now have to defend themselves against a countersuit. I think it would be in the interest of the buyers to settle. Will they? I don't know. I mean, I didn't think they would stick with it for over a year, but they did.
Yeah, I would buy the house for 1.6, but.
Yeah.
Or they still live.
Yeah, they still.
They're not tenants anymore. Yeah. So that's just an interesting one. So I guess I bring that up too. At the UAR, we do want to be aware of any sort of litigation that may be impactful for our membership as a whole. So if there are issues that you become aware of that maybe your client's involved with, or you personally, or your brokerage, we would want to be aware of that because there may be an opportunity for the UAR to get involved in some capacity. So we do want to be aware of that. So I wanted to bring that up as well. Any other questions? That's just kind of a silly example.
I have a question, but I don't want to take away from your list, because you've got some pretty exciting examples.
So this is just a regular hotline day. This is how I want it. Yeah.
So I wrote an offer on a house non-contingent. And then my client just called me and said, I'm not gonna be able to do my home equity loan. I need to sell my house now, right?
Sure.
So this is happening right now. I now need to call the listing agent today. I knew you were coming, so I thought I'd talk. Because maybe she'll call you later, right?
More than you, yeah.
I really didn't mean to do this, right? I think she's gonna think because we talked about we're gonna be contingent, then we wrote the offer non-contingent because anyway, you know the punchline to this, right?
Yeah.
So now we gotta, I know, renegotiate, now we're contingent, look at dates and all that. Or my question was, because my client might ask, can we just risk the money, move forward, see if we can sell the condo real fast? Or are we technically, did we, because we said we're not contingent, we can't perform for sure. Do you understand my question?
Yeah.
Have you passed the financial?
No, we've been under contract for like 3 days. 4 days.
Oh,
So
okay.
it's pretty new contract.
Are you due diligent?
Uh-huh.
You could back out.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, we could for sure back out.
You understand
The buyer still wants to buy the house.
the buyer still wants the house, but they need to sell their own property now, whereas
listed.
before they didn't. So in essence, things have materially changed for your buyer and their ability to buy the property.
Yes.
Ooh, that's a tough one. No, it really is, because you owe a fiduciary duty of confidentiality. Now, there are exceptions to confidentiality, and one of them is if you know of your client's inability to perform under the contract. Now, do Do you have actual knowledge that they can't perform? Could they get
She could get
financing
home
from,
equity. She could still.
could she still do that? Could she get financing from a, you know, a relative or something like that? It's, here's the issue is if section 2.2, which is, you know, the subject to sale section, you've checked no. Now it's yes, but it's yes, like 90% yes, you know, maybe it's a yes, you know what I mean? Like I'm not trying to coach you in one way that it'd be dishonest. I realize that you're saying, hey, things have changed. This is what we represent, but now it's changing. I think you talked to your client about, okay, if we disclose this, here are some potential issues. The other side may see it as a fantastic, like, hey, thanks for being transparent with us. We'll modify the rep C and we'll bring it into compliance. Or the other side will say, hey, this feels like a bait and switch. We're gonna try to cancel.
That's how I see it.
Well, that's my
Now-
biggest dilemma, Craig, is like, this transaction aside, my desire to tell the truth to my friends in real estate conflicts a lot with my responsibility for what I can and can't say, because of, like the purchase contract, right?
Right.
Because it's confusing. I used to be on the committee where we would like read these complaints and with Sean and Christie, and it's like scary to think about how people might misinterpret, because I did specifically say, great news, we're not contingent, take our offer, right? And then it's like, technically, I don't have to tell her, but I feel like I.
Yeah, I mean, if you had permission from your buyer to say, I think there's no gray area, I mean, then you get permission and you maybe use it to your advantage and saying, hey, we want to be as transparent as possible. Here's what happened. We're telling you as soon as possible so that we don't get, you know, the assumption that you're hiding things or concealing things. But it is somewhat of a gray area, because the Rep C 2.2, I wish it was more of a disclosure than a contingency. You're saying that none of those funds are going to come from the sale. That's something that the buyer declared, not you. That was something the buyer, you probably went over that section with your buyer and they understood it, they declared. And if they're now telling you that circumstances have changed, that they have to sell their house, there's no other way, then the safest the safest from liability would be to maybe modify the Rep C. And you're right, the seller may react in a way that's contrary to the desires of your buyer. Back here, and then right here, and then right here.
Because isn't that why section 2.2 was put in? Previously, we could kind of.
Use the financing.
For the due diligence, and that actually, it makes it more black and white, that if we're not covering our legal assets as the agent, as well as our client, like.
Well, that's that specific question, yes or no, right?
Yeah.
And you say no, and now it's anyway.
The other consideration would be, did you give anything along with your offer to entice the seller to accept? So what I mean by that, usually people give like a pre-qualification letter or something to that effect. Has anything in that changed? Okay, so that's the same. So did they ask for proof? I mean, this is maybe a side note, but as a listing agent, I would, if anyone ever checked no in that section, I'd say, okay, can you prove it? Can you give me some assurances that it's not conditioned upon the sale of real property? If they can't, then I'd say, well, I think you checked the wrong box. Yeah.
If the seller, so say that she talks to the seller and says, hey, I'm sending over this addendum, circumstances changed, I know how it looks, it's not how it looks, but I understand that. I'm sending you this addendum that now shows it is contingent. And the seller just simply says, decline,
They reject
it.
Sure.
At that point, she either has to have her buyer either has to perform under no contingency or cancel based on, because they're within their cancellation dates. I don't think that's the issue. I don't think she's concerned they're not going to cancel it, but the seller does have the right to reject that.
Yeah, the seller could reject that.
Right.
And then you're just kind of left, with the same contract that you already have, which frankly doesn't hurt your buyer at this point. I think at this point, your buyer's saying, look, I need to sell, so I need to build in maybe a longer window of time. I need to extend the deadlines a little bit to make sure I get my property sold and have the proceeds in order to apply towards this. Yeah.
But if the seller may have had other backup offers and now isn't able to even change it to backup status, even if they lose in the first position, they could ultimately charge if they were harmed.
They can allege that. I'm not sure. I think it's gonna be difficult for a seller to cancel in that situation.
Say, yeah, that gives them an opportunity to take backup offers.
They could take backup offers for sure,
They don't know they may need.
sure. They
Well,
may,
they have that chance no matter what,
they
right?
can always do that.
And that's my bigger question, because right now it's such an early contract. I know I could probably get out of it, renegotiate it. It's more my bigger, what do I do in my like personal ethics about, you should tell the other side this, because I would want to know, conflict with like, well, you don't have to, and your client didn't tell you that you could.
Yeah, it's difficult because of, I think based on the fact that you gave representations that they don't have to sell. And now that has changed and I don't know what the other side relied upon, but if they relied upon your assertions, that's where it becomes potentially actionable. If you don't disclose.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah, no, that's a
That was a
fine
good
one. Yeah,
So because it's fiduciary and a material fact, does it have to be disclosed?
I think so.
Yeah.
yeah. Well, it's,
Right.
Yeah.
Sort of like they lost their job.
for sure.
But still, we have due diligence and financing, and we all, right, we solve the problem before we,
Sure.
just, you know,
It's
Solve it out.
somewhat analogous. I know it's not perfect apples to apples, but let's say a buyer changes lenders.
Yeah.
Mid-transaction, do they have to tell the seller that they're changing lenders? They don't. They're responsible for their financing, so if they're unable to secure financing, they're the ones on the hook. But no, they don't have to.
So throughout the transaction that do not need to be disclosed. I'm not saying yes or no, I'm just saying, I know the kind of, you know, realtor you are, so I know before it happens, you're gonna have it resolved, but what a great question, because this
Yeah.
happens often.
I think at a bare minimum, I would want my buyer's permission before disclosing because it could potentially weaken their bargaining position. The only time you can supersede that is if you know of the client's inability to perform under the contract. And in this case, I don't know if you know, even though you have a pretty good idea that they can't perform, I don't know if you have actual knowledge that they can't perform.
So she's told me she has a couple other options for mom or this or that, or she could do
Yeah.
the HELOC, she just doesn't want to. Anyway.
If that's the
So-
case, if they have other options, then I don't think it's conditioned. Then I think no is still the right answer. If they have other options.
I think if you're worried too, and your buyer gives you permission, maybe pitch it back, say, hey, there's some things that we're ironing out, there's potential that this could go.
Right,
If they're using your sellers gonna have.
Just give them a heads up.
I don't hurt you if it does.
right, because then like she said, at least they can go in backup status.
Yeah.
you know.
Cause where I get the calls is where the day before the financing and appraisal deadline, the buyer's agent calls the listing agent and said, hey, we can't sell the buyer's condo. We need more time. And then the seller's agent, wait, you needed to sell something? Wait, where did this come from? And
Giving that information.
Yeah, and so-
Say financing didn't work.
financing them, right? Usually they're trying to negotiate an extension of deadlines, and if you do that early on, there may be a little more flexibility, because I do think that oftentimes as agents, and I think it's human nature, we think worst case scenario that they're concealing in some sort of way where that's not what you're trying to do. You're trying to balance the two competing interests. Good question.
Thank you.
I just had, and this is kind of for everyone, but how do you, get reassurance that it isn't contingent on a house selling? Would that be going to the lender and saying, I want a letter from you that says it's not contingent on them selling their house? I mean, because now apparently the lenders don't put that in. And what does the room?
I think it could be a number of things. I think it could be asking for permission to approach the lender. I think it could be proof of funds. So if they have liquidity, so if they show you how much is in their bank account, or if they show you proof of funds, that can be a way to get assurances as a seller. Especially if they're saying no financing required, I would want maybe some proof of funds. Because that seems like a cash offer, but it might not be. You know, checking no financing required doesn't mean that they can't get financing, it just means it's not required. Yeah.
You made an interesting statement, permission to approach the seller, approach the lender. Do we have to have permission to approach the lender?
You don't, but the lender should not be giving you any information without permission from their client. So again, it's kind of this You know, am I trying to go behind someone's back, or am I trying to be as transparent as possible? Again, easy for me as a non-practitioner, but if I'm looking at offers and I say, look, I want to make sure that these aren't conditioned upon the sale of someone's property, I'm going to contact lenders. Just let the buyers know. That's easy to do in a seller's market. I recognize that could flip, but that may give some transparency to the transaction.
Yeah, we talked about that with clients on Friday. The lenders aren't putting that contingency in their letter saying, you know, it's subject to the sale of the residence. So then that falls on you as the listing agent to ask that question of the lender.
Sure.
Then that's not being disclosed in.
Yeah, so
So you ask that of the lender, if the lender chooses to answer or not. If they hedge their bet, that kind of tells you, right?
Sure.
If they say, well, I can't answer that question, or I'm not authorized to answer that question, you can read between the lines on that as well. And then just a second point where you're talking about the buyer's agent calling the financing appraisal deadline and giving a totally unrelated answer to that. I think often we're our worst enemies when it comes to calling and explaining situations. We talk too much. We give reasons that don't apply to the situation, like, well, the buyer decided not to go forward because of the inspection. Well, your inspection deadline's gone, we're financing an appraisal now. That's not relevant. So if you cancel, that you're gonna have that contested, right?
Sure.
So just be careful to keep things within the right time frame in the contract, so you're not creating problems for yourself. And in my opinion, less is more.
Sure. Yeah, as a listing agent, I wouldn't say, hey, can you send me a copy of the inspection report? That probably doesn't bode well for your seller if the buyer's cancel.
My other issue is just like when, I get an offer, I have a listing and I get an offer, I'm calling their lender. And that's one question I ask. You always want to call a lender to make sure that they can get financing, right? Well, I mean, if they change lenders, that's a whole different. You always want to call the lender and they're not putting it in, just to make sure. Hey, they don't have to sell, right? Just no, that's all you're asking for. I mean, just
Sure.
maybe ask. Make that a practice.
I'll ask specifically, hey, on section 0.2, they put down, they're gonna put 100 grand. Have you verified those funds? And they'll say yes or no.
Because sometimes it's not even their house, they have to sell their car or their crypto, something, like if that money's not in the account, then it's subject to something.
Yeah,
Something.
absolutely. I mean, again, easy for me to say, but I think there's some ways before going under contract to verify how secure this buyer actually is. Right? And you know, we're still in a seller's market. It's not selling as easily as it was, you know, a year and a half, 2 years ago, but we're still in a seller's market. And so verifying, you know, certain buyers and whether or not they're qualified, I think is appropriate. It shows it from a value proposition standpoint, the seller sees the work and due diligence you're doing on their behalf. You know, it's easy for me to say, but the greatest value proposition that you have, from my standpoint, is going to be your understanding of the purchase contract, understanding the rights to cancel under the purchase contract, understanding the deadlines, understanding contract drafting. I mean, you guys are de facto attorneys, and I don't say that flippantly or casually. I mean it. You have the broadest exception to the unauthorized practice of law in the state of Utah. There's not even a close second, because you can fill out state approved forms, and one of those is the blank addendum, which is blank, and you can fill it in with whatever you want. And you guys have seen the creative language that's been out there, and I've heard it read to me over the years. Any other questions? I don't want to take too much time. Is there?
Sorry, go ahead.
What's the number one or what the most common thing you see us realtors doing? It's putting us in a legal position that we, you know, might be compromising ourselves on a daily basis. Not even doing.
Sure. I think to Ken's point, potentially breaching confidentiality, not that it necessarily gets realtors in trouble, but I mean, look at this question. Buyer's agent looks at a property that's been on the market and they ask the listing agent, how many offers do you have on the property? Or do you have any other offers? How often does that question get answered? All the time. To the benefit of the buyer. Right? And that's a breach of confidentiality. It just is. I don't see complaints about it. It just happens. But I think at times we try to be as amicable as possible, which I think you should be. But I don't know if we get nervous or excited or whatever, we start disclosing things that could be harmful to our clients. Now, some of you may be saying, well, yeah, I am nice because I want the other side to disclose things about their client. And for sure, I get you use it to your benefit. So I hear about that. Others would be just contract draft. Hands down, even really simple things that are really commonplace in our industry. There's ambiguities with them. So for example, escalation clauses. You know, buyer shall pay $2,000 over the next competing offer, period. I've seen escalation clauses as simple as that. There's a lot of ambiguity in that one sentence. Well, how long is this good for? Or are we comparing purchase price, or we're comparing purchase price minus seller concessions? Do I need to give a copy of the next competing offer? Does it have to be a bona fide offer? Do I redact names from that other offer? I mean, there's a lot of ambiguity that is left unsaid in that specific situation. Yeah.
Can you address the land listing scam and then the 40-year to make sure people are checking, just to make sure on that before they take that?
Sure.
In case there's that going on.
Yeah, so the land listings, so have you guys heard about fraudulent sellers when it comes to land listings? Have everyone kind of heard about that? The Division of Real Estate issued a press release in December about this, where you had vacant land. I mean, that's where it really is the easiest to try to scam. Vacant land where people would be calling listing agents to try to list these properties purporting to be the actual owners of the property. So usually these pieces of property are owned in the name of the joint tenants or in one person's name. And typically it's paid off, so there's not a lien against the property or anything like that. And they're trying to scam people. They're trying to collect earnest money, or they're trying to get the transaction to close. There's been at least one closing in Utah, and I don't know who's liable for that. There's going to be lawsuits from the buyers who thought they were buying a real piece of property, the sellers who weren't actually selling the property. So I think there's a couple of ways to address that. One, if it's an entity, chances are it's a legitimate owner, but I would ask a follow-up question. If the land is owned in an LLC, for example, I would ask for, hey, can you send me your articles of incorporation? That would be something only the owner would have. Or how much did you buy this property for? I think that's a good question to ask because they should know what they bought their property for. I would ask for identification. Now we are working with NAR about maybe ways that you could verify an ID, because I frankly wouldn't know whether or not an ID is fake or not. I mean, I've had some, usually it's out of the country or it's out of state. Those are going to be the types of fake identification that are being used. And working closely with the title company is going to help. So we're trying to preempt it. Title companies are fully aware, so they're stopping the closings from happening, but we don't want buyers and sellers to be under contract for weeks and they look at the agent saying, hey, how did I even get to this? So that's one area. The other is the 40-year lien. So House Bill 211 was just passed this last legislative session. This deals with these future services agreements. So they aren't actually listing agreements, but they're future services agreements to have a future listing agreement. So it's kind of confusing, but there were a couple of brokerages nationally that would approach homeowners, say, hey, we'd like to be your listing agent when you want to sell. Here's $500, $1,000. And oh, by the way, we're going to lien your property for 40 years. And oftentimes the owners didn't realize that that's what they were doing. They didn't realize that that would prevent them from refinancing. They didn't realize what that would do when they passed away, that their heirs would have to use this real estate brokerage for up to 40 years. And so what the Utah legislature did, and frankly, other legislatures have copied, saying, look, if you're going to enter into a future services agreement, you actually need to render services within 1 year of signing. And they outlawed the ability to lien someone's property in, for a future services agreement. And if someone does do that, then it will be deemed a wrongful lien. So there's some pretty severe penalties if someone does that.
Even if they accepted the money?
even if they accepted the money. Yeah, it's saying that sort of transaction is void. It's not a legal agreement. Now, they can still do that. Now, it doesn't mean that you can't incentivize the use of your services. You can offer giveaways or whatever for someone to sign a listing with you or to sign a buyer broker agreement. That's actual representation. This was just for a future services agreement saying, look, that's still illegal, but it needs to be a 1-year period as opposed to a 40-year period. Other states have followed Utah. We were the first state. Idaho, I think, was a close second 2 weeks out.
When was that passed?
That was passed this last legislative session. I think it went into law May 4th is when it became effective.
There are only like 300 or 400 that have those liens on them though, that can't be.
Yeah, there are already hundreds of these in Utah. So for you as a best practice, when you take a prospective client, you're going to want to run the PR to see what types of liens are on the property, and these will show up. And if they do show up, then you're going to want to get that resolved with that other brokerage before taking.
And would we ask our title company to run that PR?
Yeah,
Is that retroactive?
it's not retroactive. So these liens are still valid. Now, I do think that they could be challenged civilly, but that's a separate cause of action. Okay. Awesome. Yeah, one last one right here. Yeah.
Outside of, I don't know if you get this, you see anything with agent investor? I'll just leave it at that. What do you see there with agents wanting to buy a house? And the house is a piece of garbage, I'm gonna buy it, want to make it nice.
I'm okay with that. Yeah, I don't have any issues with that. I thought you were gonna go into wholesaling, and that's a different can of worms, but
You can touch wholesaling.
I- that's if you want.
Totally. I have a friend that does this.
Flippers, perfectly fine. I mean, you're gonna have the same obligations. So as a real estate agent doing, you have to disclose that you're a real estate agent upon the first initial contact. But if someone wants to sell their home for sell by owner and you're a real estate agent, great. What you can't do is be a limited agent in that transaction because conflict of interest is too great. But that's fine. You can do that. I would just be very careful in the representations about value and things like that. I would just refer to them, talk to their own real estate professional if they so choose. Wholesaling is another fun kind of area. The Division of Real Estate is looking at this. It was one of the biggest topics at their most recent conference nationwide was wholesaling. And how can members of the public be protected? So for those of you that don't know what wholesaling is, it is when buyer number one goes under contract with the seller, and while they're under contract, buyer number one is then selling or attempting to sell their interest in the contract to buyer number two. In essence, buying them out of the contract, and then buyer number two completes the contract with the seller. It's an assignable contract. Now, there are a couple of things that come into play. Oftentimes, buyer number one sells their interest in the contract in some instances of upwards of 6 figures. You know, a really large amount. And when the seller learns about that, they feel like they've been deceived, that they should have realized that, and I can understand that. It's a fine balance because technically in Utah, buyer number one does have property rights. They have what's called equitable title to the property. It is preserved so much that even sellers' creditors can no longer lien the property once the property is under contract with buyer. So it is a bundle of property rights. Doesn't feel like it is, but it is. It is a property right. The question is, you know, how do we balance protecting the public, kind of like we did with the 40-year lien, versus freedom of contract between buyer number one and the seller? Right now, the Division of Real Estate has assigned a task force to look at those rules, similar to transaction coordinators. I happen to be on both of these subcommittees, so I'll be able to highlight what happens. They are looking at not rules. They're looking at a statute change to Section 57 of the Utah Code. Section 57, and I'm not bragging. There's two sections that I'm familiar with, 57 and 61. Okay, it's not, I don't know what 48 is. I have no idea what any of these are. 57 is the real estate section. That applies to all Utahns. 61 is the licensee section. That applies to you and you only. And so they're looking at potentially changing some of the statute provisions in section 57 so that if someone's going to engage in wholesaling, everyone would have to abide by these certain. And my guess is it's going to be a mandatory like disclosure or having something within the contract itself that really highlights to the seller, hey, this is an assignable contract, and really make that as clear as possible. But for now, it's, yeah,
Really, it comes
it's
down
legal.
to disclosure on both sides. As long as
Disclosure
both parties are.
and making sure you're not misrepresenting it. For sure, it should be actionable if I fail to disclose that I'm a licensee.
Yeah.
For sure, it should be actionable if I tell the seller, hey, your property is worth 300,000 when I know it's worth 500,000. For sure, that should be actionable. The agent should be slapped around for sure. But oftentimes there's not a licensee involved. It's a member of the public who's doing this as a business. And so there's a question, should it be licensed activity? Well, technically you're a principal. I mean, yes, we would love everyone to use a realtor in their real estate transactions, but it shouldn't be required.
But if you're a realtor, then you've got to have an addendum approval for the contract being assignable because the contract says it's not assignable.
Right, section 19 would need to be.
But Joe Blow
amended.
buyer does not have to.
No. And you could, I mean, I just got done with the brokerage training at 10 o'clock this morning. They have a contract that's been drafted by an attorney that makes it assignable that they use for wholesaling. The UAR has an addendum for assignability that allows compensation to the agents involved. I mean, so in essence, we have an addendum to allow wholesaling to take place, but it often gets used on their own contracts. Yeah.
Did I hear you correctly? Did you say that when a property is under contract, it cannot be liened?
By the seller's creditors.
standards?
Yeah.
Well, how would the title company know that? How would they know it's under contract?
It's
They wouldn't.
usually the lender I've had it happen to me with the lender knew. My people were trying to get a HELOC after we were under contract on theirs listing and the lender knew. They said, no.
You're right. They wouldn't know it. They would just give notice to them after saying, hey, this property is already under contract. You need to take that lien off. And this reached all the way to the Utah Supreme Court, and they ruled in favor of the buyer that was under contract.
So if you're under contract, somebody else liens property while you're under contract, it's not
available. Yeah.
Unless it's IRS.
Even then, I don't know how it'd still be valid. Like your equitable interest is preserved as the buyer. I mean, maybe it could. I mean, maybe the IRS would be the litmus test there, but yeah.
Back in like short sale days, we did have one that popped up like the day we were closing title pull fresh PR, whatever they're called. They pulled fresh ones to look at it, and the IRS had filed a lien like 2 days before.
Oh, wow.
And we had to figure it out, like they weren't gonna let it close. They said, you've got to pay off the lien or whatever.
Yeah, how would you get that removed?
Yeah, outside of paying it, I mean, it would delay
How did
closing.
the
You would
agent
have to,
pay?
No, like, so if it's not about,
Really?
like, how do you?
you would have to file a quiet title action to have that removed, to show, hey, this isn't about.
And then the person that put it on would have to use it?
They would have to.
So would the seller be in default because the seller, it says in the contract, they can't further encumber the property or any additional liens, whatever. So would the seller be in breach of contract at that point?
Eventually,
Even
yeah.
though the lender can't really do it, the creditor, but the seller did something that created a lien.
Yeah, no, if someone's property is liened, and let's say it's a wrongful lien or it is a true lien, the seller is the one that has contracted with the buyer to deliver marketable title.
Yeah.
And if they're unable to do that,
They're
the seller is the one that is in breach of contract. You'll also notice in the Rep C, it talks about, I think in section 21, that any other parties like title companies and lenders, they're not subject to the terms of the reps. It's the buyer and the seller. And so let's say a lender drops the ball and the buyer is unable to perform by the settlement deadline. Buyer's the one on the hook to the seller. And so that's where having open communication with the other parties, when I say other parties, I mean the other ones that are involved in the transaction, that's going to be paramount to know, when your deadlines are with the buyer and the seller.
I have one other question that's about FERPTA.
Okay,
So
it's been a while. So
wouldn't it be a good standard of practice to just use that addendum in every transaction? Would it be or not be a good standard?
I think, yeah, so FERPTA deals with the Foreign Investment Real Property Tax Act. I think if I said that right. There is an obligation for a buyer to verify whether or not the seller is or is not a, U.S. it has legal status in the U.S. Because the IRS wants to capture any sort of capital gains. They do make the buyer responsible for that in withholding the proceeds if the seller happens to be a foreign person. And so by using that would at least assure contractually that the seller has an obligation. The only reason I would not hesitate, but say why it might not be necessary is that under Section 7 of the REPC, there is already an obligation for a seller to disclose. And in our UAR disclosures, we do address that as well. But I would just make sure that you do have a dialogue with your buyers in every single transaction, that they work with the title company to act as a intermediary to verify whether or not the seller is or isn't a foreign person. So while I don't think it needs to be part of the contract. I do think the next iteration of the REPC will probably make it part of the contract. But I do think you need to have a dialogue with your buyer, because whether it's part of the contract or not, they're the ones on the hook if the seller happens to be a foreign person and skips out and paying the.
Which is 15%. That's a
Yeah.
lot for the buyer, because the buyer's responsible. And who is the buyer going to sue? Me.
They're gonna look at the brokerage. Yep.
They're going to look at their buyer agent and say, well, you should have told me.
Yeah. And I'm almost positive, I mean, it's been a while since I've looked at the due diligence checklist. The due diligence checklist, I think, talks about FERPTA, which I think you can, but you don't want to be banking on that as a
Right.
means of defending yourself. You want
Seller's disclosures do too.
sellers disclosures do it. So that's where I would use a title company to verify whether or not they are a foreign person.
And that does happen. I've had two buyers, not from this brokerage, but prior brokerages when I was doing compliance, walk into my office with bills from the IRS for $33,000 and $49,000 for the seller's tax.
The capital, yeah.
They were not happy with their buyer's agent.
Oh, I'm sure.
So the title company can look that up for me.
Yeah, they can verify whether or not they're a foreign person. I mean, I would rather them than you collecting social security numbers.
Yeah.
It was the withholding made. Just because they're a foreign person doesn't, it's automatic. If the withholding was not made, then it becomes the buyer's obligation. So what's the withholding made?
Exactly. Yeah.
And there's an IRS form for that. You become in compliance on Friday with Ken, it was all about.
Awesome. Well, I've got to take off.
Awesome, Kreg. Thank you so much. That was awesome, right? Thank you. I know that we always have these great robust conversations, so I was excited for you to come. And thank you for sharing your time and talents with us. You're awesome. And you can find him anytime on our UAL legal hotline, right?
That's right. You can leave a message 24/7. We typically respond back Monday, Wednesday.
Okay.
So.
Awesome. Thanks,
Awesome.
Kreg.